There are basically two ways of achieving environmental policy goals. One is laws and regulations. Another is what are collectively known as market-based mechanisms. So carbon tax, you charge carbon emission, and people reduce carbon emission. You can legislate that you cannot emit more than certain amount of carbon, or you can require the use of a specific low carbon technology. In terms of market-based mechanisms, taxes, you tax, say, flying, and people fly less, carbon emission is reduced. Or you can use carbon markets, so people can trade their permits to pollute according to their needs. Most mainstream economists think market-based methods are much more effective, whereas many environmentalists tend to believe that we should achieve this through regulation. So on this issue, environmentalists and neoclassical environmental economists have struggled to understand each other. Robert Goodin, a leading political theorist, called this situation a veritable dialogue of the deaf. So basically, they just cannot understand each other because they don't speak the same language, they don't hear each other. So let's try to make sense of this debate and discuss what kind of tools are more effective in what way in dealing with environmental problems. So let's first consider some classic environmental problems: overgrazing of common land, overfishing of the sea, dumping of polluted water into a river, emission of carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. These are obviously examples of so-called negative externalities, someone doing something without thinking about the consequences for other people. Now, interestingly, some economists have suggested introducing property rights over environmental assets will solve environmental problem. A surprising insight from this line of inquiry is that actually it doesn't matter who owns the property in question. So when a factory pollutes a river, in a situation where, say, fishermen downstream own the river, the factory will have to give money to the fishermen for the right to pollute their river. Alternatively, the factory owner could own the river, and the fisherman will then have to pay the factory owner not to pollute his river. Obviously, the fisherman will pay the factory owner not to pollute the river only if the value that they get from unpolluted water is greater than the money they have to pay to do that. Now, the interesting conclusion is that either way, allocating property rights to someone ensures that the optimal level of pollution occurs. This outcome can be described in another way. The right to pollute basically ends up with whoever values it the most. So, for example, the factory owner keeps or buys, depending on who owns the river, the right to pollute as far as it is worth more to him than preventing pollution is worth to the fisherman. Now, this argument that an optimal outcome is reached regardless of how property rights are distributed is commonly known as the Coase theorem. This idea was first proposed by the English economist who taught first in LSE and then University of Chicago, Ronald Coase. And this is quite commonly used in economics and indeed law textbooks to discuss environmental problems. His point was actually that the result will hold only if there's no cost involved in allocating the property rights and conducting the necessary negotiations over the compensatory payment. He called this cost transaction cost, which is the central concept in a school of economics that he was one of the founding fathers, called the so-called new institutional economics. So actually, Coase's point was that transaction costs matter. Market exchanges are not costless. Establishing and enforcing property rights is not costless. And because of this, this so-called cause theorem is not going to hold in reality. He saw it as a thought experiment that emphasizes the importance of transaction cost. So actually he was very unhappy that this theorem was named after him, because he used it to prove that it doesn't actually happen. So according to the cause theorem, after trading in carbon markets, the emission permits will end up being owned by the firms which value them the most, that is, the firms with the dirtiest technologies. Basically, these firms will find it most costly to reduce emission, so they would find it easier if they just bought the right to emit carbon in the carbon market. The result is that emission reduction happens where it is least costly, because it will be reduced by the firms that will find it easiest to reduce, and then they'll sell the remaining permits to firms that find it most difficult to reduce emission. So this is known as the least cost argument. Carbon market allows the reduction of carbon emission in the least costly way. And this is one appeal of these carbon markets among policymakers. But of course, the problem is that there are some very unrealistic assumptions that have to hold for carbon markets to work in this way in reality. First of all, there's the assumption of perfect information. Now, for the emission target to be achieved at least cost, permits must end up at the firm where emission reductions are most costly. That's obvious. But this will happen only if all firms have accurate knowledge of their own emission reduction cost, and in particular how these costs may vary with emission levels. They do not necessarily know this. Even if the information is available, people have found through empirical research, firms and individuals do not seem to exploit emission reduction opportunities. So there was this famous McKinsey report in 2009 in which it was shown that many emission reduction options, like installing LED lighting or insulation retrofits of houses, they actually have negative costs. You might spend the money, but over time you're actually going to earn money by investing in these alternative technologies. But relatively few firms and households actually have done this. I mean, it's a bit of a puzzle. It could be the result of sheer inertia, or could be the result of what Herbert Simon, the founder of the behavioralist school, called satisficing. Simon pointed out that actually making the decision itself is quite costly, because you have to search the alternatives and then weigh the cost and benefits. So actually he said that people typically stop their search for solution when they find a good enough solution. They are not necessarily looking for an optimal solution, because that will be very costly in terms of search and decision-making cost. So he says people satisfies rather than optimize. So maybe that's what is going on. Maybe people look for some alternatives, they find something good enough, they just don't look at other things. But whatever is going on, it's clear that perfect information doesn't exist. And more importantly, even if reasonably good information exists, people don't seem to be exploiting it. And in that kind of world, it's highly unlikely that the carbon market is going to work according to the theory. The second assumption behind the argument for the carbon markets is that of perfect competition. Permits will not be freely traded if one or a few firms dominate the market. So for example, when the EU started this carbon market known as ETS, or emissions trading system, that was back in 2005, the Czech electricity company called CEZ was allocated a third of the country's emission permits, because it was such a dominant emitter of carbon. Interestingly, CEZ sold these permits that year when the price was high, and bought them back later after the price collapse, and then use the profit to invest in coal-based electricity generation. It completely undermined the purpose of the carbon market, but then he could do that because it was such a dominant player in the market. Thirdly, behind this argument for the carbon market, there is the assumption of perfect property rights. Basically, in order for the carbon market to work, permits need to be clearly defined and fully enforced. In reality, definition of the permits is debatable. Enforcement is a problem because that firms can just emit carbon beyond their permit if there's no government inspection, there's no punishment, and in many countries these the mechanisms are quite inadequate. Also, firms that may legitimately fear that the government may change the rules, and therefore they might be reluctant to invest in cleaner technology today because what if the government suddenly stops enforcing this? What if the government suddenly stops subsidies they used to give to solar panels? These things happen. So there's a host of problems there. But the most problematic assumption in the argument for carbon markets is the assumption of static technology. Carbon markets, in essence, work by encouraging short-term cost saving through the adoption of best available current technology. So you have the current technology. Within that technological regime, you are reducing emission. But in the long run, the best way to reduce emission is likely to involve the development and widespread adoption of new technologies, so-called green technologies. So if that is the best option, maybe carbon markets are just the barking up the wrong tree. Well, of course, when you say that, supporters of carbon markets come up with a response. Carbon markets actually give people incentive to cut emission because the more you cut your emission, the more permits you have left, and the more of them you can sell in the market and earn more money. Academic economists, including many mainstream economists, have started accepting that this is actually quite an incomplete argument that tells only half of the story. Because permit sellers, potential permit sellers, obviously have a greater incentive to innovate and develop cleaner technology in carbon markets. But permit buyers actually have even less incentive to reduce emission compared to, say, when there's a regulation. If regulation says you cannot emit more than this, then they'll somehow have to come up with the cleaner technology, but they would find it cheaper actually to buy the permits rather than trying to invest in developing cleaner technology and through that route cut the emission. There was a recent study that tried to identify the impact of EU's ETS emission trading system, and this study found that ETS increased low carbon patenting by just 0.83%. Also, past experience suggests that, as they say, necessity is the mother of invention. New technologies tend to get developed when there's a great urgency, but unfortunately, carbon markets don't force firms to innovate. Instead, these markets enable some of the dirtiest polluters to postpone innovation. Your choice of technology today constrains your choice of technology in the future. These are not independent. And we can become locked into relatively dirty technology. Yeah, so a lot of experts agree that we basically need to get rid of petrol engines and move to electric cars, and the electricity generated to feed the cars should be based on low carbon or hopefully no carbon technologies. I mean, this is kind of scientific consensus. Yes, I mean that the cars are becoming increasingly fuel efficient. The exhaust system is improve all the time. But still, if you keep using this internal combustion engine, you will be obliged to, maintain the infrastructure of petrol station, petrol dumps, Well, in the end, it's actually not that surprising that carbon markets do not provide adequate incentives for firms to invest in new, greener technologies because they are only designed to address the negative externalities. But then, as you all know, there are other types of externalities called positive externalities, which are usually generated by activities like research and development. When you do research and development, when you train workers, you generate new knowledge. Some of it is subject to private appropriation through patenting, but it also generates a lot of knowledge that cannot really be patented. Other people can imitate you. They can poach the workers, but they don't compensate you for these benefits that they are getting, and therefore you do not take those benefits into account and will do those positive externality generating activities at a level that is lower than the socially optimal level. Now, carbon markets are not even designed to address these externalities, because all it does is to control negative externalities. When you say these things, some more free market-oriented economists argue that yes, that carbon markets are imperfect, but what is the alternative? The alternative will be somehow government deciding what's going to happen and putting regulations in. And we know that the government is very bad at picking winners, so to speak, partly because they are subject to lobbying pressures from sectional interest. This is known as the government failure argument, which we discuss in our lecture on the role of the state in greater detail. And indeed, much of these investments in green technologies are made by the governments themselves these days. The recent reduction in the cost of alternative energy technologies, most of them actually have owed their existence to government intervention. So, for example, solar electricity costs have fallen by around 90% in the last decade. But did it happen through free market? Did it happen through even carbon markets? No. So in Germany, the government gave subsidies to consumers, for example, to adopt solar technology. And that expanded the market, which made investment in the technological development profitable. And then the companies started doing research to come up with better solar technology. The Chinese government gave a lot of subsidies to the producers of solar panel to reduce the cost. And they say that now solar electricity technology in China rivals that of the most advanced nations. Well, solar electricity is not unique. For example, wind electricity in Denmark, tidal power electricity in Spain, they all were developed with government support. For another example, the LED lighting, its cost has fallen similarly to solar electricity by about 90% in the last decade. Behind it was strong government actions. So, for example, EU and other countries have banned incandescent bulbs. So you couldn't make and sell them anymore. So a lot of people had switched over to LED lighting. Basically, for these technologies to develop, government support is needed until a mass market begins to emerge, at which point private firms can exploit the scale economies and begin producing at low cost. Let us discuss how carbon markets are compared to taxes, the other market-based mechanism. The key advantage of permits is the certainty that they provide in meeting a pollution target. So the target is set and permits are allocated according to that target. So that will be guaranteed. So that's the strength of the carbon market. Of course, all these assumptions that there'll be sufficient monitoring, enforcement, perfect information and need to hold, but at least in theory, that is the strength of the carbon market. In contrast, if you try to hit a pollution target by means of taxation, it's difficult to predict what kind of tax you have to implement because you do not really know how demand will respond to tax-induced changes in prices. So if hitting the target is important, yes, carbon markets are better than taxes. However, a big weakness of carbon markets is that they are even less likely to stimulate long-term investment in greener technologies than taxes are. Because in carbon markets, the certainty about total emission is effectively achieved by transferring all the uncertainty into the price. This is why carbon prices that go up and down quite dramatically. So the EU emission trading system has experienced a very high price volatility, which then discourages investment because investors do not like uncertainty. The carbon prices are very closely related to the return on low carbon investment because basically it will determine how much money you can earn with this investment. But if the price keeps going up and down, the investors will say, well, actually, I don't know whether I'll recoup my investment, whether I'll earn profit. So it actually discourages investment in low carbon technologies. To add to that, the permits are issued for free, whereas the taxes bring in government revenue. So there's that benefit on the tax side in terms of government revenue. But in the long run, the most negative thing about carbon markets is that it legitimizes pollution by conceptualizing emission permits as the right to pollute. Psychologists have shown that replacing a legal prohibition on some activity with a monetary cost actually tends to crowd out moral motivations to refrain from the activity. Even if you call that a fine, somehow it becomes okay to do it because you are paying the price. Despite all these limitations of carbon markets, many of which are accepted even by their supporters, in reality, carbon permits are usually chosen over taxes because the large companies, which have a lot of lobbying influence, prefer carbon markets because carbon taxes mean that they have to raise prices, which may not always result in increased revenue because consumers might react in a negative way, or they'll have to accept lower profit. We believe that the ultimate problem with these market-based mechanisms, carbon taxes, carbon markets, is that they are not strong enough. Actually, some of the so-called Green New Dealers in the United States made this interesting point, which was reported recently in the Economist magazine. These people said that trying to fight climate change with things like taxes and permits is akin to, and I'm quoting them, trying to defeat Hitler with a fascism tax. is not strong enough. You know that this the challenge of climate change is literally an existential threat. It's not a normal economic problem. Yeah? You need something much more stronger than these market-based solutions offered by mainstream environmental economists. These solutions simply misunderstand the enormity, the urgency, and the irreversibility of this climate change.